It is John I beheaded. He is risen from the dead. And so that's kind of already giving us a little bit of insight as to why I'm pausing and talk about John. And that's because Herod believed when he saw the actions of Jesus, again, through all these miraculous works, Herod believed without a doubt that this must have been John the Baptizer resurrected from the dead. And we haven't yet heard about John dying. We have heard about John being in prison back over in chapter 1. We knew that he was again the forerunner of Jesus, but we haven't heard any of the details. And so for whatever reason, Mark determines here that it's time to tell that. It's time to insert that. And I think it's because ultimately there's going to be such a huge contrast that exists between Jesus and his work that is so much greater or has become a greater work than John's, and it should, and what John was able to do in preparing that way. And so when you start out here in verse 14 and it tells us that it says, and King Herod heard of him, that is, he had heard of the reputation of Jesus. He had heard of all the great things Jesus was doing, these miraculous works. And if we were to track back through, there were so many things that Jesus had expressed his power over danger, his power over devils, his power over disease, his power over death, his power over disappointment. And that's just me lining up the words that I can remember. But there are no less than at least 14 different instances already in the preceding chapters where Jesus had done miraculous works that caused him to stand out, to stand above, to stand beyond what anyone else could possibly do. But yet King Herod here says, this just has to be John. There's no other explanation for this. He's not willing to accept that the Messiah, Jesus, was actually coming to the world. He's blaming that it just has to be John. Now, something interesting that we learn here, if we dig through this quote, King Herod here in verse 14, this is not the same King Herod that was alive and ruling, if you will, as king when Jesus was born. You remember when Jesus was born, in and around that time at least, the men had taken back the information, let them know that Jesus had been born in Bethlehem and such. And what did Herod want to do then? Herod the Great was who he would have been known as. Herod the Great wanted to have him put to death. And so the blanket solution he come up with, you'll remember this as Bible students, is Herod said, well, the only way to be sure that I'm not going to have a king that steps in, because they had already began speaking of Jesus as being the king or the baby king, born a king. He wanted to make sure that he would never overrule him. So his solution was to take and have all the baby boys under 2 years old put to death. And the assumption was that that took care of things. At least that's what we can assume Herod the Great thought. But by the time we get to this part of the text, then we have a listing here of someone else, and it is a different person named King Herod. What we actually have here is not Herod the Great, but one of his sons, Herod Antipas. Now, we actually have that listed out, not just here, but in some of the parallel accounts that it's Herod Antipas. But the interesting thing about Herod Antipas that stands out to me when I kind of review it and go back through it is that technically speaking, King Herod Antipas was not a king at all. He actually was a tetrarch. That is, he was more or less, and we use modern words to understand it, but he was more or less a governor that had been placed over a certain province that happened to be Galilee, where Jesus was at that current time. He was not necessarily a king. Now, Herod the Great was a king. Herod the Great had been given that authority by the Roman Empire, by the Caesars. He had been given the authority to be the king over the whole land, but Herod Antipas was not that. He was one of about 10 sons born to Herod the Great, and he was born actually through one of Herod the Great's, I believe it was second marriages, what have you, but he was actually, in one sense, the lesser of the sons that Herod would give birth to. King Herod, quote unquote, here, Herod Antipas, the governor or the tetrarch, was one of the lesser of those. And he had never been given by his father nor by anyone else the authority to be an actual king. He more or less was given a position that would be more like a title. You know, sometimes if you have someone who is prominent or maybe who is wealthy, who is successful, whatever, sometimes even in modern times you'll have them give their children some little positions in the business, whatever. Don't amount to a hill of beans what they actually do. They're not important to the business or not important to the lifestyle that they live, but they're just kind of given a title. That's where Herod Antipas was. But it was spoken of him in time, at least, in the province around Galilee, and wider than that. He was often referred to as King Herod because that's the way he wanted to be seen. He wanted people to recognize him as being that highest authority in the land. He wanted to be seen in that way, and many times, according to what we read, not just here, but in history, Josephus speaks of this quite a bit. He actually had petitioned himself before his father earlier, then his father had passed, but actually had petitioned himself before others, Caligula being one of those, that he wanted to be made a king. Even if it's going to be a narrower span, if he was going to be a smaller province like Galilee, just call me king. And his wife had pushed him in that many times, it seems. She had been herself longing after that authority and that power, and she had pushed him after that. But again, he never actually received that authority. Now we read across that, at least I have, and you think to yourself, okay, well, if that's the truth, if that's the historical background, the fact that he was not really a king, then why does inspiration allow Mark to have it penned as it is? Because it is what the word is here. Why is he listed here as being, quote, King Herod? Well, I hate that he's sick today, but I'll use him in illustration anyway. How many of us in here know what Bobby Watts is to Munford, or at least the Munford community? You won't guess this till I say it, but did you know that in common vernacular among the people, Bobby Watts is the mayor of Watts Road? We love Bobby, and we know that's a fact. I mean, that's just what you had to accept. He is the mayor of Watts Road. Self-proclaimed, sure enough, but we accept him as that. And so if I were to write a story or write down a record at one point, maybe I'm in the historical society of Munford, 40, 50 years removed, and I wrote down that Bobby Watts was once the mayor of Watts Road, there could be someone come back later and say, no, that is absolutely wrong. So the entire history that Jim wrote down, or the entire listing of information, is wrong, because Bobby Watts was never the mayor of Watts Road. Now, who's right, who's wrong? Well, in reality, in fact, yes, it would be true. He was never the mayor of Watts Road. But in the way that he would be referred to in history, that very well may be the case. It may be that we would give him that credit. He enjoys that kind of ribbing back and forth that some of us give with him. And he calls me regularly. And if I address him in a certain way by saying just a plain old hello, he'll say, listen, who you talking to? It's the mayor of Watts Road. I only use that because that's a similar situation to what we have here. We've got someone who in common in the community would have been just casually referred to as, okay, he's not a king, but we'll call him King Herod. The difference is, though, Bobby understands, and he jokes about all that, the difference is the concept of being king was so close to Herod Antipas's mind that he wanted that to be a reality. And so again, time after time he had petitioned for such, time after time he had fought for such. But I think the whole time in his history of his reign, which basically comes from about 20 A.D. up into about 39 A.D., an entire span that he ruled. And I think he started ruling at 16 years old, so you can kind of see that concept coming in as well. But the entire time he ruled, he wanted to be seen as king and referred to as such. And so Mark does no injustice to the text. If you read Matthew's accounts when Herod Antipas is mentioned, Matthew will sometimes call him king. He'll sometimes call him tetrarch. So they're accepting both titles just because that's the way he is recognized. And in this is where he is. But again here, I believe there's quite a bit of envy, quite a bit of jealousy that comes in. And when you develop the account, as we continue to read it, you'll see why Herod, even though he had little authority, he took advantage of that authority and ultimately would have John the Baptizer put to death. So it says, verse 14, and King Herod heard of him, and his name was spread abroad, and he said, that is John Baptist that is risen from the dead. And therefore mighty works do show forth themselves in him. And so his ultimate conclusion was simply drawn from the fact that he believed that there's no possible way that we can explain in our recent history why anyone could do these miraculous works, why anyone had this skill, why anyone had this following. Now, keep in mind especially this, and that is if you put the Bible in the order in which it goes, you obviously have the Old Testament, you have the New Testament. You've often heard before, and I won't try to explain all of it, but if you go right between the pages of Malachi and Matthew, so just a few pages back for me to visually see it in our Bibles, this copy I have happens to say the end of the prophets. You turn the page, the next page is blank, as we often refer to it, and then the next page says the gospel according to Matthew. There's a 400-year-ish span that exists between the end of the prophets, which is what that literally was. It's not only the end of the Testament, but it was the end of God using spoken prophets before the people for a long period of time. So 400 some odd years pass by, they haven't heard nor seen of a prophet. And so when John the Baptizer comes on the scene, and he claims himself to be a prophet sent from God, and he claims himself to have some information about the Messiah, the Christ that is coming. He claims to be a witness to his, which, by the way, in my mind, at one point, John the Baptizer was the first witness of our Lord anyway. Remember what happened when Mary goes down and visits with Elizabeth there? It says the baby, speaking of John, leapt in her womb. And the only reason that could be mentioned in Scripture is because it's more than coincidence. It's the fact that he would be that. You read John's account specifically in John chapter 1. It is John the Baptizer who sees Jesus afar off and says, "Behold, take a look at, examine the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." So John would be the first prophet in a long dry span, if you want to call it that, of 400 some odd years it takes place. So they have John, and so Herod says, okay, they've had one, these Jews, looking at through Herod Antipas's eyes, they've had one prophet in the last 400 years in history, and that prophet was John, and I put him to death, and I intended on that to be the end of this, but apparently he's back. Because now they've got a new prophet, which he believed to be, again, the old. And it's even, I'm going to put my term with it, not his, worser. Because he can perform miracles. And one of the things, and I may use a miracle or so in the next hour, but one of the things that I've noted about the miracles of our Lord, we've got about 32 to 36-ish miracles recorded. According to John's account, if the miracles Jesus ever did were recorded, the world itself could not contain those miracles. John chapter 21. John chapter 20, we're told that John's miracles were given so that we might believe Jesus Christ is the Son of God. But these miraculous works, even that Mark is recorded up unto this point, all of those have proven again and again and again that he is the Son of God that he said to be. And none, write this down, none of those miracles were ever in their time questioned. None of them. I said that to say this. Herod Antipas is amazed at what he sees. But at the same time, he's offended at what he sees, because what he has done by putting John the Baptizer to death is he has tried to end this whole situation of prophets coming before the people. And at the same time, this one that he thinks might be John has resurrected from the dead. That's a spit into his face in some senses. Of course, we mentioned there, we read across a moment ago, verse 15, chapter 6 of Mark. The others said that he's Elias. Others said that he's a prophet or one of the prophets. And of course, speaking of Jesus, that's what they had said about him and would say about him. Matthew 16 gives us that record and other accounts as well. But that's what Herod says. So I want to divide this text up. I'll give you one word outlines for it. But if you look at verses 14 and 15 that we've already read across and somewhat discussed, this Herod Antipas, again, tetrarch, verse 14 and 15 makes an observation. And the observation he makes is apparent, and that is, this has to be John the Baptist resurrected. That's who Jesus had to be. He had no other explanation of that. And then second, verse 16, let's read it. There's also a situation. Here's what it tells us. But when Herod heard thereof, he said, it is John who I beheaded. He is risen from the dead. And that's the situation for him. Because again, Herod Antipas thought he had ended this whole, I'm going to put his word in it, probably not ours or God's, but this whole fiasco had been ended, supposedly. He'd done away with this man, John. He had helped himself advance. He had protected himself from anyone overruling or coming over his reign, so he thought. But he says, I beheaded him. And we don't have the detail of this in any other place, but if you keep reading verse 17, the explanation develops. For Herod himself had sent forth to lay hold on John and bound him in prison. For Herodias' sake, his brother Philip's wife, he had married her. Verse 18, and John had said unto Herod, it is not lawful for thee to have thy brother's wife. And so this situation here gets bad because of the record. Explanation of it is John had stood up to him. It wasn't enough that Herod was intimidated, I would probably assume, by John, but John had come and stood up to him and actually called him out for his sin. Now, you have to understand that there's a lot going on here. First of all, Herod Antipas would not directly or necessarily find himself, we'll use a bigger word, but it's amenable, or if you will, under the law of Moses. He would not necessarily accept that. That includes the Levitical law of Leviticus chapter 18, for example. He wouldn't necessarily have wanted that. But even in his day, for a quote-unquote king, and we've already explained what he was, but what he was thought to be or assumed to be as king, a quote-unquote king would not he would have his authority stripped from him if he decided to divorce his wife. So he wanted to keep face. Even though he's remarried now, even though he's chosen, according to what we're reading already, he's married his brother Philip's wife, he's trying himself to keep face. And so what he wants to do, I assume, is just to kind of let this just happen and to let this just slip in and nobody ever says anything about it. And that's sometimes the case when you got someone who's mixed up in anything that could be sinful or harmful or whatever. You'll find people's immediate kind of jerk knee reaction to it is just let it go by. Just don't say anything about it. And when you got someone in authority, you find that actually happening a good bit. Someone who is clout, who has authority in the community, or a wise businessman or whatever, someone who's accepted in authority at least, a lot of times whatever they're involved in, it just kind of slides under the radar and it's just known among the people. You just don't talk about this or that. But John does not make that type of choice. John understands a few things. One, he understands according to Levitical law. You can put this in your margin. Leviticus 18 and verse 6 and other passages among that text talk about the limitations that are placed on marriage. And a lot of that Leviticus 18 is incestual type of limitations. Not marrying sisters and first cousins, and there's a number of things listed there in Leviticus 18. But one of the things that's listed is that you cannot marry your brother's wife. Now, we understand that there are instances, you think about Ruth and other instances, doesn't contradict where the brother dies and then, the brother takes the wife on and his responsibility. Not talking about that. We're talking about Philip, who is alive and well, who Herodias determines, and Herod Antipas determined if they're somehow in love with each other, and he just steps in, just steals his brother's wife out of his hands. So he's breaking Levitical law, even though he doesn't claim to be amenable to it necessarily, but he is. At the same time, he is getting involved in the divorce, which would have looked bad on him just as a leader, if you want to call it that, quote unquote. And at the very same time, he's committing adultery because that's how he got her. He's not in a relationship with a woman who was unmarried or something of that sort. He's stealing his brother's wife. And so John the baptizer steps in and plain out says, it is not lawful to have thy brother's wife. And watch what happened then. Therefore Herodias had a quarrel against him and would have killed him, but she could not. Why couldn't she do it? Verse 20. Well, she didn't have the authority, and she did not have, at that point in time, she didn't have the right plan, because she's trying to come up with it, but she didn't have the plan to do it either. But she could not. Verse 20. For Herod feared John, knowing that he was a just man and holy, and observed him when he heard him, did many things, and heard him gladly. Now, I've kind of got a couple marks in this verse that stand out to me, but one thing that points out real quickly, I have to start to see some of the parallels that exist between John the Baptizer and his being put to death, and ultimately later, what would happen to Jesus. First, John is going to be killed here in the context. Is John being killed for a good reason? He's being killed for telling the truth. He's being killed for actually, honestly, loving and caring enough to try to point out the sin and the wrong of these people. But as he's put to death, it is said of him that Herod knows this. He is a just man. He's a holy man. And actually, Herod, to some point, liked him. At least he liked hearing him. You fast forward to Pilate. When Jesus finally gets through these kangaroo courts and he lands in front of Pilate, what's Pilate's initial reaction to our Lord? Pilate's somewhat honest to begin with. Pilate understands that this man that you brought in front of me, he's done nothing at all wrong. He's not guilty of anything worthy of death. Pilate understands that Jesus himself is a righteous man, that Jesus himself is there because of the accusations, the false accusations made by everybody else. He's only there because of what we find in Scripture, because of envy to begin with. Similar to this situation, there are many parallels that exist, but at least similar to that. But again, the interesting thing here comes down to the fact that he had observed him and he heard him gladly. Now, I've tried to dig in and try to imagine, and that's really where I have to dig. You have to dig into your imagination to try to think, how could Herodias and ultimately Herod Antipas, how could they despise John enough to ultimately about to have him beheaded, his head lopped off in front of the crowd there and brought in a platter is what it ultimately ends up being. How could they at the same time, could he, quote, hear him gladly? I don't know that this is the case, but societally, if you want to call it that, societally, it was widely accepted that people like to hear others speak. They like to one point or another to be entertained. And John was no question a preacher. John was of no question someone who spoke. Among other things, you have to understand, it's not that he walked in and all that he ever said to Herod was just, hey, you don't have no right to be with your brother's wife. He obviously did that. I think he probably did that on more than one occasion. But he enjoyed hearing him to one point. Watch verse 21. And when a convenient day. Now what this seems to indicate is this is just a day when it just worked out. It was a day where there's probably some premeditation to go in it from Herodias' part at least. But a convenient day came, verse 21, that Herod on his birthday made a supper to his lords, high captains, and chief estates of Galilee. Now this has something to do with why he'll fulfill the promise that he makes later, and it very well comes down to the fact that his pride takes over. What's involved ultimately in Jesus being put to death? Well, it's the envy of the men. It's Pilate standing there saying he's a just man, he's done nothing wrong. Surely he understands that. But at the end of the day, it's Pilate saying, look, I'm not going to take the brunt of what's happening right here. If the people want him crucified, then we'll just have him crucified. Pilate, to one point, being too prideful to change the course. Not wanting to be seen as weak is what happens here, it seems. Verse 22, and when the daughter of the said Herodias came in and danced and pleased Herod to them and sat with him, and the king said unto the damsel, ask whatsoever thou wilt, and I will give it unto thee. So he's got all these people in the room. He's having a party. You can assume that half of them are drunken or something like that. His daughter, or I think it's probably the way it reads. This is just my suggestion. It may very well be a stepdaughter. This could be one of the children. We find out later it's going to be Salome, but this could be actually one of Philip's children, born of Herodias earlier, before they ever married. But he brings this young lady in, this damsel, and she dances in front of them. She pleases them to some point. And he says, what will I give thee? And he swore unto her, whatever thou ask of me, I will give thee unto the half of the kingdom. Now, in all reality, there's a few things involved in his promise. One, he's just being rash, okay? He put himself in a situation in the midst of this party. The damsel comes out, pleases him and others, whatever that involved. And he puts himself in a pickle where he says, I'll just give you whatever you want. And he makes a statement so bold, up into a half of the kingdom. Two problems with that. Number one, he couldn't give away that kingdom because the kings couldn't do that necessarily. Number two, and more importantly, he didn't have this kingdom he spoke of. Again, he was more of a tetrarch of Galilee, not the king over this whole area as he tried to claim. He had done nothing really to give in that standard. And she, that is the daughter, verse 24, went forth unto her mother and went forth to her mother, what shall I ask? And she said, quickly, the head of John the Baptist. How long had this been brewing in her mind? How long had Herodias been in her mind rolling back through and saying, look, I don't like what John says. I don't like that he tells Herod, my husband, Antipas. I don't like that he's constantly telling him that we have no right to be married. I don't like what I'll lose if for some reason Herod were to finally listen to him, because again, we've already been told, Herod heard him to one point gladly. Herod either enjoyed or at least accepted some of what he said. Again, that's the reason why sometimes, even in ourselves and our own sins, or the sins that we're involved in with others, that's why sometimes there's no repentance, there's no change, because we don't like the outcome of that. We don't like the end of that. People tend to look at the temporal things and consider them and say, okay, what will I lose? If I start living this way instead of that way, what will I lose? You take and I'm using the term broadly, a very shrewd businessman. Maybe someone whose business practices are very questionable. Maybe it's a matter of some crookery that they're involved in, whatever. They're making money hand over fist, maybe illegally in some sense. And you take them down to an end and they finally begin to see they're wrong. But at the end of the day, what do they want most? They want to keep the status quo. Hold on to what we have, whatever it takes. Remember Jesus when he encountered what we referred to through the gospel accounts as the rich young ruler. The ruler comes up and he basically boasts about the things that he has. Jesus is not discrediting that he has those things. What does he require of him? What does he ask of him? Go sell it. Give it to the poor. Just give it up. Give all that up. You can have me. It's basically the trade out. He's unwilling to do that, at least according to what we have recorded. Why is it that Jesus, when encountered on similar situations, has to talk about the worth of a value of a soul and ask questions like, what will a man give in exchange for his soul? And the options he gives is, would he be willing? If he could gain the whole world, would that be worth it? The end of that account is, no, it's never worth it. No matter what you can have. If it's not spiritual, if it's not eternal, it matters none. But Herod and Herodias seemingly want to hold on to whatever relationship they're involved in. So she immediately says, go ask for the head of John Baptist. And she came in, verse 25, straightway. This is immediately that Mark uses 44 times. And she came in immediately or straightway in haste to the king and asked, saying, I will that you give me by and by in a charge of the head of John Baptist. Look at the king's reaction. And the king was exceeding sorrow for yet his oath's sake. For there is, and I literally have a tear in my Bible right here. What are the next words of verse 26? I didn't take a penknife to it, but it's missing. I'm in verse 26. Somebody just read verse 26 if you don't mind. Mark 6. Okay, for those that were there. Yeah, Pilate gives him over because he doesn't want to seem weak, and he wants to give the people what they desire. So then verse 27, and immediately he sent an executor and commanded his head to be brought, and when he beheaded him in prison, and brought the head in a charger and gave it to the damsel, and the damsel gave it to her mother. And when the disciples heard of it, they came to his corpse and laid it in a tomb. And the apostles gathered, verse 30, themselves together unto Jesus and told him all things, both what he had done and what they had taught. So what do we have right here? We have, again, kind of an aside, kind of a pulling back the curtain real quick in these three areas, I think: observation, situation, and explanation, to give us background as to what happened to John the Baptist. And the main reason it happened was because John was willing to speak what? Truth. John is willing to stand up. John is willing to stand up in a situation where you have to only assume he knew it could cost him his life, but he doesn't back away from it. And so there are a number of things involved in here. I think one, you have to understand, I think there's some dangers involved at least. One danger that I think occurred in the context is that there was a danger that Herod didn't understand, and that was the danger of a guilty conscience. Because why is he so concerned about Jesus? He doesn't, again, he's trying to blemish over who Jesus really is. Why is he so concerned? Because to some point he feels guilty for this. It even told us he was exceeding sorrowful for what he had done. And so he just wants to say, okay, this Jesus that you have running around here, this Jesus performing all these miracles, that has to be John the Baptist. That's the only person it can be. There's some guilt that's involved there. And the problem arises that guilt itself from our sin, which should be present, by the way, not denying that. I sin, I fail, I stumble, whatever you want to call that. I should feel guilty for such. But guilt here is continued to haunt him because of the wrong that he did. So the solution would have been not to have done the wrong ultimately in the past. You can already assume in this, and it's what's missing from my little tear right here in verse 26, but also look to or assumed back over in verse 21, you have to know that there is some peer pressure involved. Who, again, I'm trying to write in between lines and they're not there. Okay, I'll admit that they're not there. But who in the room would you think could have taken some responsibility and said, okay, that I'm not going to do that. I'll do an awful lot, but when the daughter comes in after speaking with Herodias and comes back in the room and says, I tell you what I want the head of John the Baptist. Who could have stood up right then and said, no, we're not going that far? Only Herod. Only he could have stood forth and done that. That's not to say that Herodias could have made a different choice without so much spite and evil in her heart in the room next door. Not to say that the young damsel could not have done anything different, but just to say that it was up to him to do that. But he's being influenced by the people that are there in the room and his unwillingness to take a stand that, I guess in his mind he thought, would have made him feel weak. Romans 12 and verse 2, very common. Be not what? Conformed to this world, but be ye transformed. How is that going to occur? By the renewing of your mind. So you may prove what is that good, acceptable, perfect will of God. And so there were options available, but in this case, that's the truth. And you have to be careful with your words too. Because when he gives over the suggestion, at least, that he's willing to do anything, he feels in some sense, for whatever reasons, obligated to do just that. That's what we have, kind of an aside. Any questions, comments? All righty. We got groups coming in from both directions. Thank you.